gonna move now to the next speaker. I'm gonna call upon Dr. Babu Ayendo. He currently serves as a GSN Senior Advisor for Programs and Curriculum Design. He has previously served as a senior lecturer at Hamashel Peace Center in Mendol, Zambia, and a senior program advisor for peace in East and Central Africa program. He holds a bachelor's in education from Kenyatta University and has a master's in peace and security studies from Eastern Mennonite University in the US, and has a PhD in peace and conflict studies from the University of Otago in New Zealand. He's been in the field of peace building for over 25 years. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to share my screen. Chair, is this working okay?
Yes, we can see the screen, thank you.
Yes, so greetings everyone, and we really appreciate you creating time to join us today, wherever you are on this earth. And just to appreciate the elders, the leaders, friends, comrades who've come to this very important conversation. So the title of my presentation is Healing-Centered Peace Building, a Storyteller's Perspective on Health and Healing. And I want to dedicate this presentation to my three children, Steve Biko, my firstborn, and Thomas Sankara, the secondborn, and Ernesto Che Zambezi, the lastborn. I want to start with a quotation that kind of frames what my thinking, what my feelings are about the question of mental health and healing in Africa. This comes from Ben Okri, the Nigerian novelist. And he puts it beautifully: to poison a nation, poison its stories. A demoralized nation tells demoralized stories to itself. Plant stories in the ears of your children. It is the predominant stories that shape our psychology. So as you journey with me in this presentation, I'd like us to listen to the echo of those words by Ben Okri. To poison a nation, poison its stories. Plant stories in the ears of your children. It is the predominant stories that shape our psychology. Now, I was very fortunate in my younger life to be raised in a rural area with my grandparents, Josephina Ongecha Nyotenda, and a great artist we've been working with called David Raduli has done a wonderful pencil portrait. That's my grandmother holding my firstborn son, Steve Biko. I also listened to the stories of my grandfather, Kwara Odera K'Ogwande, a community builder, a carpenter. And they told me stories when I was very young, for they loved me. It is only later in life that I began analyzing and thinking about what kind of stories were these that my grandparents were telling me. What was their purpose? What was their goal? And I also heard stories from other people. So in adulthood, I was able to kind of synthesize the kind of stories I heard from my grandparents and other people around me. My grandfather talked about our history as a clan, the feats we had achieved, the challenges out there because he used to travel a lot as a builder. Those stories remain with me. My grandmother, her stories focused on imaginary human characters, animals and plants. And her stories had very troubling endings. Stories of the lion and the giraffe, stories of the cockroach and the monkey. Those were the stories of my grandmother. My aunties also told me stories, and here I need to clarify. In the Luo culture, aunties are the sisters of your father, not the sisters of your mother, as is predominantly understood in our colonial culture. The sisters of your mother were your mothers, which means they had every right to discipline you, to do whatever they needed to do the way your mother would do, whether she was present or absent. But the aunties were the sisters of your father, whose stories were very admonishing. They were very didactic. They focus on ethical behavior. And by the way, this continues until today. For example, for me, it is my aunties who asked me, have you begun any relationship with any girl at the university or in college? My grandfather would not ask me that. My grandmother would not ask me that, but the aunties would ask. They had the license, they had the permission in our cultural environment. Then there are the stories of my uncles. Again, I need to clarify. In the Luo culture, uncles are the brothers of your mother, not the brothers of your father in the predominant colonial culture. Because the brothers of your mother were the people who offered you comfort. They spoiled you. They were even able to critique your father's people. So if there was a crisis in the village and I knew I was wrong and I knew I would be disciplined, the place to run would be to my uncle's home. Fortunately for me, my uncle's home was only about an hour and a half walk away. So I would disappear and go to my uncle's. And nobody would reprimand me. They would just sit there, listen to me, and they'll critique my father's people. So in my adulthood, I realized just how fortunate I was to listen to all these streams of stories from my grandfather, talking about the history, our feats, who we are not, my grandmother, the animals, the plant, imaginary, troubling endings. The aunties that I wanted to avoid, actually I used to call them cantakeras aunties, because as soon as they showed up, they had something to say about your behavior, and the uncles who supported you. One of the things I took from my grandfather was the whole idea of tungni. In Luo culture, when my grandfather spoke of tungni, it meant there was an imbalance. It meant there was instability. It meant there was chaos. There was conflict. Things were not in harmony. And as I kept on interacting with my grandfather and other people, I got to realize that this was the idea about ill health and health. For him, connection to the creator, to the ancestors, to nature, to fellow human beings, the yet to be born, was health. A disconnection, a breakdown of those bonds, a breakdown of relationships created ill health. To the extent that my grandfather would say, if you have a conflict between two people, it's not just about the two people. Once you have a conflict between the two people, it will affect other people around them, the relationship, and even the ancestors will not be happy. So it was a much broader and holistic definition of tungni, imbalance, instability, chaos. Remember, The mother of my grandfather was a herbalist. My grandmother, Oranga, was a herbalist. She was a healer. And therefore, my grandfather, Odera K'Ogwande, was very conscious about how one action by one person in the community actually connects with something else that might happen. And you might not be able to see the connection, but for him, he would be able to see the connection. That was the idea about health and balance. So one of the things I observed with my grandfather and grandmother while growing up in rural Western Kenya was the whole concept in Luo culture, we call it Budho, which basically means you relax together and just talk. You don't have to win an argument. You don't have to tell fantastic stories, but you'll just talk. And this was usually after people have completed their morning chores, you've done your bit, you've done your lunch, and in the afternoon, you just relax in the homestead and just talk. And my grandfather had a special place for meeting young boys, men, just to talk. He would just say, come, biwabudhi, wadwabudo. Come, let's just be here and talk. And in the talking, we talked about gombaka. Gombaka just basically meant telling stories. And it was very interesting, I observed with my grandfather and later on my dad. The storyteller only tells half the story. They leave things hanging so that those who are listening can actually join in and continue telling the story. Then number three, because I was very close to my grandparents, I was doing their letter writing and letter reading. So I had their stories transmitted to other people, particularly their children who are working in the urban cities like my dad, and others. So I would hear their stories. They entrusted me with very confidential information. It shaped the way I looked at storytelling and how you reframe things in order to make sure that the message gets through. But then I experienced a crisis. I started my formal schooling in Nairobi. And I love storytelling. My grandparents had prepared me. So I was in the school's drama club. And at St. Paul's Primary School in Nairobi, Mbotela, we were doing this play called Mamzele Makabonya in 1981. This play was banned. When we asked our teachers, I was only 12 going to 13 then. I asked my teachers, why are we banned? Oh, they say, it was political. It was political. In 1987, my brother took a play I had written called Comrades Battalion. He was also in the same school, St. Paul's Primary. They did very well. And at the finals, Comrades Battalion was banned. So I began asking myself in a very serious way, why is government afraid of drama? Why is government afraid of stories? I grew up with that fear. And you begin realizing that, you are living in a colonial society. So when I co-founded Amani People's Theater in 1994, the idea was we want to spread the message of peace because our elections were marred with violence from 1992, except 2002. Every time there was an election, there was violence. So we said we'll come together, 14 of us, and we'll create an aesthetic program and we'll spread the message of peace to the communities. But what happened in practice, we realized this is not simply tribal clashes, as the government was telling us. There were larger structural issues and our toxic political culture. we realized that there was unhealed trauma passed over generations. Some of us were born in the shadows of colonialism, but the reality is it was there, right on our face. Our society, to use my grandfather's words, was in Thiong'o. It was in fragmentation, to use the words of the novelist Kwara. And we had a traumatized political leadership. And therefore, healing had to become an integral part of what we were doing. And by the way, I need to footnote here. Of the 14 young people who studied Amani People's Theater in December 1994, 3 of them actually pursued academic courses in psychosocial healing and drama therapy, because it came out of that practice. So you begin asking yourself, why is government always concerned about stories? So we turn to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And in Penpoints, Gunpoints, and Dreams, he talks about 4 aspects where there is a struggle between the artist and the ruler or the politician. He says in Gikuyu epistemology, the creator of the universe shared the same meaning with that of the artist as molders. Because the politician wants permanence, order, control, but the artist will always want to ask other questions and say it is still unfinished business. Then he talks about the Socratic aspect. Art will always ask the uncomfortable questions. Then he talks about the Andinesian aspect, that in its innocence, artists and storytellers will have the courage to call out the naked emperor. Then Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about the voice aspect. And he talks about art tries to restore voices back to the land. It tries to give voice back to the silenced. And there is something Ngugi doesn't talk about, which I want to mention. You only allude to it. I think for me, in my experience with my grandparents and in Amani People's Theater and wherever I've gone, art rekindles or reactivates the voices of other people to rediscover the artist and healer innate in each individual, in each human being. So there is a struggle there that you need to be aware of when we are talking about mental health, healing in our societies. But then at Amani People's Theater, because of the challenges we were confronting in our practice, we had to do a lot of reading, a lot of it. And that's when we came across the writings of Bantu Stephen Biko. Why were these important during that time? Unlike other liberation movements, Steve Biko, Mampela Rampele, Bani Pitiana, Strini Moodley, and others had done a thorough study of liberation, including using armed struggle. And they said, no, there's something we are not doing right. Psychological liberation has to be the precondition for other forms of liberation. Because they recognize colonialism and apartheid had damaged our people at individual and collective level and systemic level. And this was deliberate. Because when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, this is what I saw also in Aotearoa in New Zealand. Colonialism attacks children, particularly boys, because then that becomes a very long-term trauma in society. Because once you traumatize children, this can go on for 100 or even 200 years. So unlike the African National Congress, and even the ZANU-PF, and even the KANU in Kenya, and even the TANU in Tanzania, what the Black consciousness movement had recognized is that there was importance for such psychological liberation first. Why was that important as well? Colonialism attacks your sense of creativity and imagination. It tells you cannot create. Because if you go back to the origin of the term culture, culture comes from the Latin verb cultus. Cultus means to cultivate. It means clear the land, transform the land, make changes, make transformation. That's what colonialism does. And as we know, Naladuk, the Native American scholar, tells us the origin of the term colonial or colonialism is colon in our body. Colon helps us to digest. Colonialism makes us unable to digest, unable to imagine, unable to be creative. So Biko and Black consciousness emphasize Black us and Black theater for us to say we are human. We are here. We have a mission. And then number 3 is in the process of liberation, Biko and Black consciousness reminded us, never ever dehumanize yourself to the level that you reproduce your oppressor. It is the same thing that the Somali novelist Nuruddin Farah talks about Somalia. He says part of our problem is we have become the little dictators that we want to overthrow. Biko taught us, don't dehumanize yourself. So these teachings of the Black consciousness movement in the books I Write What I Like and Bounds of Possibility was so important for us at Amani People's Theater and later on in our work. As we said, what kind of society are we working towards? When we recognize that our people are sick, we are sick, our politicians are sick. Let us not be smart about it. Let us not deny it. Let us confront it. So we go back to Fanon. Frantz Fanon had a very interesting analysis, Wretched of the Earth. He says for the storyteller, here is a psychiatrist from Martinique and Algeria. Many people quote Fanon, but they don't talk about Fanon on how he focused on storytelling and what he calls the native writer. He says, usually in the first phase of colonization, the artist will want to create works of assimilation so that their works correspond point by point, what he calls point by point, with those of the colonizing power. But in phase 2, there is a period of anguish because the artist and the storyteller goes through distress. There's difficulty. And the phrase Fanon uses is, death is experienced. And out of that, we go to phase 3, according to Fanon, where the artist and the storyteller begin to shake the people. And you see the emergence of a revolutionary literature. Because at that point, the storyteller, quoting Fanon, want to compose the sentence which will express the heart of the people. Here is a psychiatrist talking to us about the role of the artist and storyteller in healing. What are the implications then? The question for me would be, where are we in terms of composing that sentence which expresses the heart of the people? I know I say this often, but I get into trouble for it. We are at a point where we need to confront the reality that we are living in colonial societies. 5 decades after political independence in Kenya, we are living in colonial societies. We have what we call the native colonialist. So the question is, where are our artists and storytellers in this? Are they still in assimilation? Phase 1. Are they experiencing death and anguish? Or are they ready to take part in the freedom and the liberation of their people? So for me, mental health cannot begin to capture our problem. It just can't. It's an important part, but a very small part. What we are experiencing is much larger because it is the tungni that my grandfather talked about. It is the inability to believe in ourselves, to imagine that a better world is possible. Still, as Steve Biko taught us, we have to tell stories that pump back life in the empty shell of the oppressed people. You know, when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, I spent a bit of time with the indigenous Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I would listen to the songs, what they call the waiata. And I could see there were some songs that were being sung in a melody, or in a style that I was not very familiar with. I was in the northern island of New Zealand, Aotearoa, as the indigenous people call it. So I asked Megan Tamati-Quenell, I said, why are these songs being sung differently? And this is what she told me. She said, I was told by the elders that the reason the waiata is being sung this way is that our ancestors were very conscious about not passing on the pain of generation of colonialism. They wanted the waiata to pass the message, not the pain. Pass the message, not the pain. In other words, are we able then to break this generational cycle of violence? This trauma that has trapped us for generations. How do we break the cycle? That becomes our challenge. So number one, my suggestions. Remember, like my grandmother, Josephina Ongecha, Nyotenda, and my grandparents and my uncles and aunties, we are all artists and we are all healers. The Burkinabe scholar and practitioner, Malidoma Patrice Some, says, healing is horizontal. It cannot be hierarchical. You cannot say, I will go to a place and then there'll be somebody who will come and diagnose me. No, no, no. He says, we've got to learn that all of us in society are artists. We can imagine. We can hold space for each other. We can be healers. Each and every individual is not the preserve of a few. Number two, we heal in our own indigenous languages. Number three, as Ben Okri says, people are as healthy as the stories they tell themselves. I am saying, let every space be a storytelling place. As the Luo people say, let's go back. Let's tell our stories. Let's heal through our stories and make those stories transformative. And this is part of the work we've been doing at the Green String Network with communities and the National Police Service. Let every school, let every bar, let every place of worship, let the market be a healing space. Number four, remind ourselves that political leaders will always want to control the narrative in their governance, in their oppression. We have to reclaim and amplify stories that heal and break the cycles of violence. And remember, our leaders too are a very traumatized lot. So we have some task there. We need to center the healing of the land and our ancestors. Someone might say, oh, you know, this sounds a little bit fancy. The late Ali Mazrui, when he was asked, if you could distill what is the problem of Africa, he has written, I don't know how many books, maybe over 20, but he distilled it to a very simple paragraph. The ancestors are angry with us. Centering the healing of the land and the ancestors is important. We have rituals that will take us from Tungni to balance. Remember, the Luo people, the Maori of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Itauke of Fiji, and many African people, they bury the placenta in the land. For the Maori, the word whenua is both the placenta and the land. So land is not just a commodity. We are land. That is why the Luo, when they make a decision, the elders stand up and say, Ping Owacho, the land has spoken. When the land has spoken, the people have spoken. And my grandfather used to say, when you shed human blood and it goes to the land, there are rituals that must be made to correct the tunguni, the disequilibrium you've created. The land in Africa is in tears. Our ancestors are in tears. We need to decolonize, indigenize, and amplify those stories that help us heal. Because at the end of the day, we must dismantle colonial capitalism. When I was doing some healing work in Moroto in Uganda, I met a young man called Stephen Abura. I was in a workshop. And he told me, Babu, this is a very good workshop. We've gone through a nice healing process. But the sense I get is this. This trauma healing work is like changing the wheel of a vehicle when that vehicle is running. The work we are doing now is important, but we must focus on dismantling colonial capitalism so that we do not reproduce the trauma, so that we have systems that engender structural healing and structural peace, cultural healing and cultural peace. So as I come towards the end, I want to quote two people. Like I said earlier, a healer does not heal you. Mariam Hasna tells us. She's someone who holds space for you while you awaken your inner healer, so that you might heal yourself. We are all healers. When you see the grandmother's bench in Zimbabwe, or what my friend and colleague Jonah Gokova was doing in Padare, with the boys and the men, it's a simple process of holding space, of telling stories, so that we are all awaken our inner healer. But as Sisonke Msimang puts it beautifully in a recent TED Talk, she says, it is justice that makes the world a better place, not stories. The stories will take us to that place to dream, to envision. But we must have a plan for social justice. Because, as Steve Biko taught us, the great powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military outlook, but the greatest gift still has to come from Africa, giving the world a more human face. Zikomo, asante, thank you very much.
Asante sana. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think it's really getting us to think a little bit deeper. I think in most of our African cultures, really storytelling is something that we do all the time. So how do we use the storytelling to begin to also foster healing? I think very interesting. I can't wait to get some of the discussions towards the end.